Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we are not walking into a battlefield, or a Senate hall, or the shadow of a Colosseum. Tonight, we are entering a dining room. The lamps are low. The air is heavy with honeyed wine and crushed herbs. Cushions are arranged carefully, not for comfort alone, but for rank. Somewhere nearby, a slave waits silently, holding a silver platter too heavy for comfort. Somewhere else, a door opens to reveal a dish that was never meant to nourish, only to impress. This is ancient Rome at its most revealing. Because here, at the banquet table, power did not shout. It reclined. It ate slowly. And it watched who was watching. Tonight, we will drift through the extravagant world of Roman dining, not as chefs or critics, but as quiet observers. We'll see how emperors ruled with food, how silence was enforced between courses, how luxury became language, and how even the smallest crumb could carry political meaning. So settle in, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft murmur of an ancient feast to carry you gently toward sleep. When dinner became a weapon. In ancient Rome, a meal was never just a meal. It was an announcement. The moment a guest crossed the threshold of an elite Roman home, the performance had already begun. Not with food, but with space, the width of the doorway, the height of the ceiling, the number of slaves who did not speak. Dinner was Rome's quietest battlefield. The Romans called these gatherings convivia, living together. But the word disguised their true function. These were carefully engineered encounters where alliances were tested, rivals were ranked, and loyalty was measured without a single speech being made. One did not attend a banquet to eat. One attended to be seen and to see. The food came slowly, intentionally. Each pause allowed guests to observe one another, who reclined easily, who ate cautiously, who laughed too loudly, who waited for permission before reaching for the next dish. Every movement was read. In a world where open ambition was dangerous, dining became a safer language of power. A host did not need to declare his dominance. He simply demonstrated it through abundance, patience, and control. A table overloaded with food was not generosity. It was proof that the host could afford excess, that his supply chains were strong, that his reach extended beyond the city, beyond Italy, sometimes beyond the known world. But restraint could be just as powerful. Serving fewer dishes, but rarer ones. Offering silence instead of spectacle. Allowing a guest to wait, just a little too long. These were signals. Roman writers understood this well. Seneca, watching his peers gorge themselves, noted with bitterness that men no longer ate to live. They lived to eat and ate to be admired. But admiration was only one goal. Fear was another. A guest who did not know what the next course would bring, or whether it would bring pleasure or humiliation, remained compliant, grateful, careful. In this way, the Roman banquet became a controlled environment, a room where power could be exercised without bloodshed, where the host was judge, stage manager, and sometimes executioner. And yet, beneath the silk cushions and polished silver, there was another truth. None of this splendor belonged to the people who made it possible. The hands that prepared the food did not recline. The backs that carried the platters did not rest. The voices that seasoned, stirred, and served were trained to disappear. The Roman banquet was magnificent because it was built on invisibility. And the more extravagant the meal, the more invisible its makers had to become. Reclining into authority. To understand Roman power, you must first understand how they lay down. The most striking thing about a Roman banquet was not the food, but the posture. Guests did not sit, they reclined. 3 large couches, called lecti, were arranged in a horseshoe shape around a low table. This arrangement formed the triclinium, the heart of elite Roman dining. Each couch held several guests, propped on their left elbows, leaving the right hand free to eat. This was not comfort. This was choreography. Reclining required practice, balance, control. It signaled leisure so complete that one did not even need to sit upright. Only those who were free, truly free, could afford such stillness. Slaves stood. Citizens reclined. The position of each body mattered. The middle couch was the most prestigious. And on that couch, the rightmost position, the locus consularis, was reserved for the guest of highest honor. That seat could make a career, or end one. To be invited to it meant recognition. To be moved away from it meant disgrace. No announcement was necessary. Everyone noticed. Hosts used seating the way generals used formations. A rival placed near the entrance, where servants brushed past constantly, knew he had fallen out of favor. An ally placed close to the host's shoulder understood that influence was growing. Even silence spoke. If conversation flowed toward you, you mattered. If it skipped over you, you were already fading. Emperors mastered this language. Augustus, ever subtle, used seating to reward loyalty without speeches. Nero used it to humiliate. Domitian, paranoid and precise, rearranged guests mid-meal, watching faces tighten as status shifted in real time. There were even cushions for animals. Favored pets reclined beside their owners on miniature pillows, silent reminders that proximity to power could elevate even a creature with no voice. And through it all, slaves moved like shadows, pouring wine, wiping hands, removing plates before guests had finished, never interrupting, never acknowledged. The reclined posture allowed diners to look down, physically and socially, reinforcing the hierarchy with every bite. To eat while lying down was to declare, "The world works for me while I rest." And once you understood that, the food itself became something else entirely. Not nourishment, but proof, garum, and the smell of power. If Roman power had a scent, it would not have been incense or roses. It would have been garum. Long before a guest tasted anything at a Roman banquet, they smelled it. Not always immediately. Sometimes it lingered faintly in the air, woven into sauces, soaking into meat, hiding beneath honey and spice. Other times, it announced itself boldly, drifting through corridors before the first platter appeared. Garum was unavoidable. It was a fermented fish sauce made from the parts of fish most people would discard: intestines, blood, gills, layered with salt and left under the sun to rot slowly into liquid. Weeks turned into months, months into years. What remained was a thick, amber fluid with a smell so strong it could cling to clothing and skin long after the meal ended. To modern noses, it might seem unbearable. To Romans, it was civilization. Garum was not merely a condiment, it was a declaration that decay itself could be mastered, that time could be controlled, that rot could be refined into luxury. Factories lined the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and southern Italy, where enslaved workers stirred vats of fermenting fish under relentless sun. The stench was so intense that garum production was banned within city limits. This was not something polite society wished to acknowledge, yet it depended on it completely. There were grades of garum. The cheapest was cloudy and harsh, consumed by soldiers and laborers, but the finest varieties, aged, strained, clarified, were translucent and costly, traded like perfume or wine. Amphorae were stamped with the producer's mark, the region, even the year. Aged garum could be worth more than gold by volume. At elite banquets, hosts boasted about its origin the way modern collectors discuss vineyards. This one from Carthage, that one from Baetica. This batch aged longer than the last consul's term. The smell itself became a signal. Only those accustomed to luxury could endure it calmly. A guest who recoiled revealed unfamiliarity, perhaps weakness. One who smiled and reached forward demonstrated belonging. Garum went everywhere. It glazed roasted meats. It sharpened sauces. It appeared unexpectedly in desserts, paired with fruit to create a sweet, salty contrast Romans adored. Doctors prescribed it too, mixed with vinegar for indigestion, applied to wounds, taken as a tonic. In Roman thought, fermentation was not corruption, it was transformation. Proof that nature, when disciplined, could serve power. To eat garum was to participate in empire. Every drop carried with it the labor of distant coasts, the patience of time, and the authority of those who could afford to wait for rot to become refinement. And waiting mattered, because only those with surplus could afford to let food sit unused for years. Only those confident in tomorrow could allow today's catch to decay slowly into luxury. Garum taught Romans something fundamental. Abundance was not about having more. It was about wasting without fear. And that philosophy spread beyond fish sauce into every corner of Roman dining. Spices, distance, and the cost of desire. When a Roman host lifted the lid from a dish and a wave of unfamiliar fragrance drifted across the triclinium, every guest understood what it meant. Distance. Not metaphorical distance, but real distance. Deserts crossed, seas sailed, borders negotiated, lives spent. Spices were not flavors first, they were proof. Black pepper came from India, cinnamon from Arabia, saffron from lands so far east, most Romans could not imagine them clearly. These substances traveled thousands of miles along trade routes guarded by soldiers, taxed by governors, and watched closely by imperial accountants. A single pound of pepper could cost a laborer months of wages. To sprinkle it carelessly was to announce immunity from consequence. Spices were small, but they carried weight. They could be stored, displayed, and deployed strategically. Some emperors locked them away in treasuries alongside jewels. Others scattered them deliberately, turning scarcity into spectacle. Imagine sitting at a Roman banquet when a servant begins dusting saffron over roasted peacock. The threads glow red gold in lamplight. Everyone knows what they are worth. Everyone smells the sharp floral bitterness. No one speaks, because this is not generosity. This is dominance. Among all spices, none captured Roman obsession like silphium. It grew only in a narrow strip of North Africa. Its flavor was said to be unlike anything else. Sharp, fragrant, impossible to replicate. It cured ailments, enhanced food, served as medicine, contraceptive, and aphrodisiac. It was stamped on coins. And then it vanished. Harvested into extinction, silphium became one of history's earliest examples of desire consuming its own source. Romans wrote about its disappearance with genuine grief, as though the land itself had withdrawn a gift in protest. But extinction did not teach restraint. It taught urgency. If a spice could disappear, it must be used publicly while it still existed. To hoard it was foolish. To display it was wise. So spices were thrown into wine, mixed into sauces in absurd quantities, used not to enhance flavor, but to overwhelm it. This was intentional. A dish so heavily spiced that its original taste vanished became a canvas for wealth. It said, the ingredient itself no longer matters. Only the cost does. Exotic animals followed the same logic. Giraffe, ostrich, flamingo, parrot. These creatures did not belong on Roman plates. That was precisely the point. To eat them was to demonstrate that nowhere was beyond reach, that the empire could not only conquer lands, it could consume them. A roasted ostrich was not dinner, it was geography. Each bite erased distance. Each platter collapsed the world inward, toward Rome, toward the host reclining comfortably while the planet fed him. And the guests knew it. They tasted conquest. And yet, for all this power, there was always unease beneath the spices, because what traveled far could also hide danger. Poison, adulteration, imitation. A host who used too much spice risked suspicion. Was he masking something? Was the excess flavor a distraction? Thus, spices became a delicate balance, enough to awe, not enough to alarm. A language of measured extravagance. One learned not only how much to use, but when. And those who mastered that language rose quietly. Those who failed were remembered, if at all, as cautionary tales. Garum, decay, and the luxury of waiting. If power in ancient Rome could be tasted, it would not have been sweet. It would have been sharp, salty, lingering, and it would have come from something already dead. Long before the first platter reached the triclinium, before cushions were adjusted and wine diluted just so, the presence of garum could already be felt. Not always directly. Sometimes it hovered faintly beneath the surface of other aromas. Honey, herbs, roasted meat. Other times it announced itself boldly, seeping into corridors, clinging to cloth, marking the evening before anyone reclined. Garum was not subtle, and that was precisely why it mattered. At its simplest, garum was fermented fish sauce. But to call it simple is misleading. It was made from the parts of fish no one wished to acknowledge. Intestines, blood, gills, scraps, layered thickly with salt and sealed in massive vats. These vats were then left under the open sky, exposed to sun, heat, insects, and time itself. Weeks passed. Then months. Sometimes years. The mixture slowly broke down. Flesh dissolved, bones softened, liquids separated. What emerged was a translucent amber fluid, strained carefully from the sludge beneath. That liquid was garum. The smell was powerful enough to banish it from cities. Garum factories were pushed to coastlines, far from polite neighborhoods, where enslaved laborers worked knee-deep in rot. Roman writers complained openly about the stench. Laws restricted its production within urban walls. And yet, no elite table could exist without it. This contradiction was central to Roman luxury. The things most essential to power were also the things least discussed. The more refined the dining room, the farther away the labor that fed it had to be. garum carried the memory of that distance. Not just physical distance, but moral distance. A host who served garum was not offering comfort. He was offering proof that he could command time itself, that he could afford to wait while food spoiled into something greater, that he possessed the patience and surplus necessary to let nourishment rot without fear of hunger. In Rome, waiting was privilege. The poorest citizens lived meal to meal. Soldiers ate what they were given. Slaves consumed scraps when allowed. But garum demanded delay. It demanded storage. It demanded confidence that tomorrow would come unchanged. That confidence was power. There were many grades of garum. The cheapest was cloudy, thick, and harsh, consumed by the lower classes and military units. But the finest varieties were filtered until clear, aged until mellow, and bottled carefully in amphorae stamped with their origin. Baetica, Carthage, Sicily. Each name carried prestige. At banquets, hosts spoke of garum the way later societies would speak of wine. This batch was older, that one smoother, this producer more reliable. Guests nodded, understanding that this was not about taste alone. It was about familiarity. To appreciate garum was to prove one belonged. Those who recoiled revealed themselves immediately. A grimace betrayed inexperience. Hesitation marked uncertainty. But those who accepted the flavor calmly, who dipped bread into sauce without comment, signaled that they had been here before. Garum was a test. It separated those who had grown into power from those merely passing through it. The sauce appeared everywhere, drizzled over meat, mixed into vegetable dishes, added to fruit, creating contrasts Romans adored. Even desserts were not spared. Sweetness was sharpened deliberately, forcing the palate to work. Roman cooks understood something modern chefs still chase. Intensity commands attention, and attention was the currency of the elite. Doctors prescribed garum as well, mixed with vinegar for digestion, applied to wounds, taken as tonic. In Roman medical thought, fermentation was not corruption but transformation. The breakdown of flesh was a process that released hidden strength. What decayed properly became potent. This belief extended far beyond food. It shaped Roman views of aging, governance, and empire itself. Rome, too, believed it improved with time, that conquest matured into civilization, that chaos fermented into order. Garum was edible philosophy, but behind every amphora stood a body. Enslaved workers stirred vats under relentless heat. They scraped residue. They strained liquid through cloth. They breathed fumes that lingered in lungs and hair. Some historians believe long-term exposure caused illness. Others note that garum workers were rarely mentioned at all, which may be the point. The Roman elite consumed the result while forgetting the process. The farther the source, the purer the pleasure. At a banquet, garum did not arrive alone. It came layered beneath spice, beneath presentation, beneath spectacle. It rarely announced itself directly. Instead, it supported everything else, deepening flavors without demanding credit. Invisible, like the people who made it. And yet, despite its hidden role, garum remained one of the most expensive, most desired substances in the Roman world. Entire coastal economies revolved around it. Amphorae traveled along trade routes guarded by soldiers. Taxes were levied, fortunes made. Decay became industry. Time became commodity. And when a host served garum generously, he was not feeding guests. He was reminding them that he owned the future. Because only those certain of tomorrow could afford to let yesterday rot slowly into luxury. Spices, distance, and the hunger for the impossible. When a Roman guest inhaled the scent rising from a newly uncovered dish, what they were breathing in was not merely aroma, it was distance. In ancient Rome, spices did not belong to kitchens in the way we understand them today. They did not sit casually on shelves, waiting to be used. They arrived slowly, carried across continents by hands that would never taste them. They passed through ports, caravans, deserts, and treasuries before ever touching a Roman tongue. Every grain had traveled farther than most Romans ever would. Black pepper came from India, carried by merchants who followed the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean, then overland through Arabia and Egypt before finally reaching Roman markets. Cinnamon arrived wrapped in myth, its origins deliberately obscured to keep prices high. Saffron, fragile and vivid, demanded enormous labor, thousands of flowers harvested by hand to produce a single pound. These were not ingredients. They were evidence. To use spices extravagantly was to announce mastery over distance itself. To scatter them carelessly was to declare that geography held no power over you. A single pound of black pepper could cost a Roman laborer several months of wages. And yet, at elite banquets, pepper was poured freely into sauces, rubbed into meat, even stirred into wine. Not because it improved flavor, but because it erased restraint. Restraint was for those who feared scarcity. At a Roman banquet, fear was weakness. Guests understood this immediately. When saffron threads were tossed into wine, turning it golden red, the room would often fall silent. Everyone present knew the value dissolving before their eyes. This was wealth not saved, not invested, not protected, but destroyed deliberately, in public. That destruction was the message. I can afford to waste what you cannot afford to own. Some spices were considered so valuable they were locked away in imperial treasuries, alongside gold and jewels. Others were rationed carefully during shortages, their absence noted more keenly than the absence of food itself. Because hunger could be endured, but exclusion could not. Among all spices, none haunted Roman imagination like silphium. It grew only in a narrow strip of land in North Africa, near modern-day Libya. No one successfully cultivated it elsewhere. Its flavor was said to be unlike anything known, sharp, fragrant, almost divine, but its reputation went far beyond taste. Silphium cured ailments. Silphium enhanced pleasure. Silphium prevented conception. Silphium stimulated desire. It was medicine, seasoning, and social tool all at once. So prized was silphium that its image appeared on coins. Governors taxed it heavily. Roman writers described its harvest with reverence, even anxiety. And then, quietly, it disappeared. Over-harvested, over-traded, consumed faster than it could regenerate. The Romans noticed too late. By the 1st century, silphium was gone, spoken of in the past tense, remembered like a lost god. Its extinction became one of history's earliest warnings, though Rome did not hear it as such. Instead, silphium's disappearance intensified desire for everything else. If something could vanish, it must be displayed while it still existed. Thus, spices became more than flavor. They became urgency. A host who used rare spice publicly was not being careless. He was declaring victory over time. He was saying, I possess this now, and that is all that matters. Exotic animals followed the same logic. Flamingos, ostriches, giraffes, parrots. These creatures were not chosen for taste. Many Roman writers admitted openly that they were unremarkable or even unpleasant. Their value lay elsewhere. They came from far away. To serve them was to collapse the empire inward, to bring the edges of the world directly onto the table. Each dish was a map rendered edible. Each bite erased distance and reinforced dominance. A roasted ostrich was not dinner. It was geography reduced to meat. Guests understood this. When presented with such dishes, they did not ask whether they tasted good. They asked where they came from, how they were transported, who secured them. Conversation drifted toward logistics, not flavor. Power always reveals itself through supply chains. But spices carried a shadow as well. Because what traveled far could also hide danger. Poison. Roman elites lived in constant fear of assassination, a sudden illness, a bitter aftertaste, a guest collapsing mid-course. These were not uncommon rumors. Spices could mask poison. Strong flavors concealed bitterness. Heavy seasoning raised suspicion as easily as admiration. Thus, hosts walked a delicate line. Too little spice suggested poverty or timidity. Too much invited fear. The most skilled hosts mastered balance. They dazzled without alarming. They impressed without threatening survival. This required knowledge, restraint, timing. Spices were language. And like any language of power, misuse carried consequences. Even emperors learned this lesson. Those who overindulged became legends and cautionary tales. Those who measured carefully endured longer, quieter reigns. In the end, Roman spice culture was not about hunger. It was about longing. Longing for what lay beyond reach. Longing to own distance. Longing to compress the world into a single room where one reclined comfortably while the planet labored. And that longing never truly disappeared. It simply changed form. But at the Roman table, it was unmistakable. Every grain of spice whispered the same message. The world is large, and I have eaten it. Exotic animals and eating the empire. When an exotic animal appeared at a Roman banquet, it arrived already defeated, not slain in battle. Not captured in the arena, but conquered in a quieter, more unsettling way. It arrived cooked. In ancient Rome, the act of eating unfamiliar creatures was not curiosity. It was not culinary experimentation. It was domination made intimate. To place a rare animal on the table was to declare that no corner of the world lay beyond reach, not even its living bodies. Guests did not look at these dishes with hunger. They looked with awe, and sometimes with unease. Imagine reclining comfortably while a servant approaches carrying a platter unlike any you have seen before. Long legs, unfamiliar bones, a bird whose shape does not belong to Italy or even Europe. The room grows quiet as the dish is set down. This is not dinner. This is empire. Flamingos were prized not for their meat, which Roman writers admitted was unremarkable, but for their tongues. Hundreds of birds slaughtered so that a single course could exist. Ostriches were boiled, roasted, dissected. Giraffes, creatures Romans could barely describe accurately, were consumed simply to prove they could be obtained. The taste mattered less than the story. Where was it captured? How far did it travel? How many hands did it pass through? Every answer reinforced the same truth. Rome could reach you. The Roman elite understood something fundamental about power. It becomes real when it enters the body. To conquer land was impressive. To eat its animals was something deeper, more personal. The empire did not merely rule territories. It digested them. each exotic dish collapsed distance. Africa, Arabia, the edges of Asia, all reduced to flesh and bone beneath silver knives. The guest did not need to imagine conquest. He tasted it, and the animals themselves became symbols. Flamingos represented the far south, heat, marshland. Peacocks symbolized immortality, their feathers believed never to decay. Large fish signified naval dominance. Trojan pork, a boar stuffed with smaller animals, mirrored military cunning. Nothing was accidental. A Roman banquet was carefully curated theater. Even shock was intentional. Some hosts reconstructed animals after cooking, reattaching feathers, reshaping bodies so that the creature appeared almost alive. A roasted peacock might arrive with its golden feathers restored, as if it had simply lain down to rest. The effect was unsettling. Guests laughed nervously. Some applauded. Others looked away. The line between admiration and discomfort was thin, and hosts enjoyed watching guests navigate it, because discomfort was revealing. Those who smiled easily understood the rules. Those who hesitated betrayed unfamiliarity with excess, and excess was the language of belonging. Yet for all the spectacle, these meals revealed something darker. They revealed how normalized cruelty had become. Roman writers occasionally paused to remark on it. Seneca, ever critical, mocked the endless hunt for novelty, noting that men now searched the seas and skies for creatures they had never eaten, simply because boredom had become intolerable. When everything is available, nothing is satisfying. Thus, the search expanded outward. New provinces meant new animals meant new displays. The empire's expansion fed not only its armies, but its appetite for astonishment. And that appetite was endless. The logistics behind these meals were staggering. Animals had to be captured alive, transported over vast distances, kept alive or preserved, guarded, fed, and finally prepared by skilled hands. Many died before ever reaching Rome. Others arrived weakened, injured, frightened. Their suffering was invisible at the table. Only the result mattered. And yet, not everyone could afford such displays. Exotic animals were the domain of emperors, senators, and the ultra-wealthy. For lesser elites, imitation became strategy. Chefs disguised common meats as rare ones. Spices masked flavors. Sauces transformed texture. Illusion mattered as much as authenticity. If you could not serve an ostrich, you could at least convince guests they were eating one. This too was power, because belief often mattered more than truth. But behind every illusion stood labor. Slaves tracked animals. Slaves fed them. Slaves prepared them. Slaves risked punishment if a dish failed to impress. The more exotic the animal, the greater the risk. A poorly prepared dish could end a career, or a life. And yet, the diners reclined, unbothered. They spoke of philosophy. They discussed politics. They admired the feathers, never the hands that held the knife. To eat an exotic animal in Rome was to confirm one's place atop an invisible hierarchy that stretched from the dining couch down through kitchens, ports, provinces, and wilderness. A hierarchy built on silence. But silence does not last forever. As the empire aged, the novelty dulled. What once astonished became expected. The bar for spectacle rose higher, excess escalated, and when even giraffes no longer impressed, emperors turned to cruelty itself as entertainment. live animals released into dining halls, surprise terrors, psychological games. The meal ceased to be nourishment or display. It became intimidation. Because when food can frighten you, power has reached its most intimate form. The Roman banquet, once a stage for elegance, became a reminder of vulnerability, that the same hand that fed you could just as easily destroy you. And the animals, silent, cooked, consumed, were the first lesson. Empire does not ask permission. It eats. The kitchen. You never saw slavery, silence, and invisible genius. If you followed the sound of a Roman banquet backward, away from the laughter, away from the clink of silver and the murmur of reclining guests, you would eventually arrive somewhere very different. The kitchen. It was hotter, darker, louder, and no one reclined there. Roman kitchens were places of urgency and fear, not artistry as we imagine it today. They were crowded with bodies moving quickly, shoulders brushing, hands working without pause. Fires burned constantly, smoke clung to the ceiling. Orders arrived suddenly and without warning. Mistakes were not corrected. They were punished. The people who made Roman luxury possible were enslaved men and women, often captured from conquered territories. Among them were Greeks, prized for their culinary knowledge, their understanding of sauces, timing, balance. A skilled cook could be worth more than a gladiator. Wealthy households competed fiercely to own the best. But ownership was the key word. No matter how brilliant a chef's skill, it did not belong to them. It belonged to their master. These enslaved cooks did not simply prepare food. They engineered illusion. They understood how to disguise cheap meat as rare game, how to balance spices so precisely that guests never questioned authenticity, how to shape, color, and reconstruct dishes to shock and impress. They were chemists before chemistry had a name. They were performers who never appeared on stage, and they lived in constant danger. A dish that failed to impress could result in flogging, sale, or worse. A banquet that embarrassed its host might end a life. The more extravagant the expectation, the thinner the margin for error. Some cooks slept beside the hearth, barely resting between feasts that could last days. Others were forced to taste every dish first, not as honor, but as insurance against poison. They were human shields. The Roman elite rarely acknowledged this reality. Writers praised hosts, not cooks. Recipes were attributed to patrons, not hands. Even Apicius, the most famous name associated with Roman cuisine, was likely not a single man, but a tradition, a label attached to techniques developed by enslaved chefs whose names were never recorded. Their knowledge survived. They did not. Cookbooks like De Re Coquinaria preserve instructions in cold, practical language. Quantities, timing, pairings. No commentary on who prepared the dish, who risked punishment if it failed, who inhaled smoke until their lungs weakened. The text is silent. That silence is intentional. Roman society depended on erasing labor to elevate leisure. The smoother the banquet, the less visible the work behind it. Slaves were trained to move quietly, to anticipate needs, to disappear into walls. A well-run banquet felt effortless. Effortlessness was the illusion. Behind every seamless course was exhaustion. Behind every reconstructed peacock was careful, trembling labor. Behind every perfect sauce was someone whose hands burned constantly, whose body bore scars no guest would ever see. And yet, despite this cruelty, mastery emerged. Roman enslaved chefs refined fermentation, developed complex emulsions, understood heat control, and balanced flavor profiles that modern chefs still study. Their techniques influenced Byzantine, Islamic, and later European cooking. Civilizations built their cuisines on this stolen genius, but Rome did not reward it. Freedom was rare, praise rarer. Most cooks died enslaved, their bodies worn down by heat, fear, and repetition. And still, they cooked. Because survival required excellence. There is a quiet tragedy in this. The very people most responsible for Roman culinary greatness were denied even the dignity of recognition. Their creativity fed empires, yet their names vanished. The banquet table concealed this truth beautifully. Guests reclined, discussing philosophy, while slaves hovered just outside vision, listening for a bell, a glance, a raised eyebrow. Every movement was choreographed, every pause rehearsed. Silence was safety. A slave who spoke unbidden risked punishment. One who broke a dish risked worse. Accidents were not forgiven when luxury was at stake. Roman writers occasionally let the truth slip through. Seneca mentioned the cruelty casually, as if it were inevitable. Others joked about punishments meted out for minor mistakes. The jokes were warnings. And yet, without these invisible kitchens, Roman power would have collapsed inward. The empire could conquer land, but it could not cook without enslaved minds and hands. Luxury was built on suffering, and the more extravagant the feast, the deeper that suffering ran. This knowledge lingers beneath every description of Roman dining. It hums quietly under the spectacle, the spices, the silver. It reminds us that history's most beautiful scenes often depend on unseen pain. The kitchen you never saw was the true engine of empire, and Rome worked very hard to make sure you never looked. Wine, poison, and the anxiety of power. Wine arrived at a Roman banquet long before the food did. It was poured slowly, deliberately, diluted according to custom, and offered first not as pleasure, but as signal. The cup in your hand told you where you stood, what you were worth, whether you were trusted. In ancient Rome, wine was never just a drink. It was ritual. It was weapon. It was warning. Roman wine was rarely consumed straight. To do so was considered barbaric, uncivilized, even dangerous. Instead, it was mixed with water, honey, herbs, sometimes seawater. The proportions mattered. A weak mixture suggested restraint or insult. A strong one hinted at indulgence or intent. Hosts chose carefully. A favored guest received wine aged properly, perhaps from a legendary harvest like Falernian, dark and smoky, once served by generals to celebrate victory. A rival might be offered something thinner, sharper, inferior, a quiet humiliation disguised as hospitality. Guests noticed. They always noticed. Wine carried memory. Certain vintages were associated with historic moments, political triumphs, famous banquets. To serve an aged wine was to summon the past into the room, to align oneself with legacy. Julius Caesar understood this well. He served specific wines to seal alliances, knowing that shared intoxication loosened tongues and softened resistance. A treaty signed sober was binding. A treaty sealed in wine felt inevitable. But beneath the elegance of the ritual flowed anxiety. Because wine was also the most common vehicle for death. Poison was a constant fear among Roman elites. Emperors rose and fell quickly. Senators disappeared after dinners. Sudden illness was rarely assumed to be natural. The banquet table, for all its luxury, was one of the most dangerous places in Rome. To drink was to trust. To trust was to risk. This is why wine rituals became so elaborate. Cups made of silver or gold were believed to detect poison, changing color if danger lurked within. Slaves known as pregustatores tasted dishes and wine first, sacrificing their bodies to protect their masters. Their reactions were watched closely. A hesitation, a cough, a pause too long. These could halt a feast. Sometimes the taster died, sometimes nothing happened. Either way, the message was clear. Someone else's life stood between power and risk. Wine was also deliberately manipulated. Romans added substances to alter flavor and texture: honey for sweetness, resin for depth, herbs for aroma. Some added powdered lead, unknowingly sweetening wine while slowly poisoning themselves. Chronic lead poisoning likely dulled minds, damaged bodies, and shortened lives. But the effect was invisible, gradual, and thus ignored. Immediate pleasure mattered more than distant consequence. That philosophy shaped Roman rule as much as Roman dining. At banquets, wine loosened more than muscles. It loosened caution. Guests spoke freely after enough cups. Jokes turned sharp. Secrets slipped out. Emperors listened. Tiberius, suspicious and withdrawn, used drunken banquets as traps. He let guests drink heavily, encouraged conversation, then remembered everything. Words spoken under the influence resurfaced later as charges, accusations, condemnations. Refusing to drink was dangerous. It suggested distrust. It implied accusation. It marked you as someone withholding allegiance. To decline wine was to reject communion. So guests drank and worried. The anxiety never left. Even as wine warmed the body, fear cooled the mind. Every sip balanced pleasure against survival. Some hosts exploited this tension openly. They served unusually strong wine, watching who faltered. They switched cups suddenly. They delayed refills to see who asked. Power observed best when others were unguarded. Yet wine also carried comfort. It softened long evenings. It slowed time. It allowed the illusion of ease. A well-poured cup could calm nerves, smooth conversation, make the banquet feel almost humane. That illusion mattered, because Roman life was brittle. Status shifted quickly. Favor vanished without warning. Wine gave the temporary feeling of stability, warmth in the chest, heaviness in the limbs, a momentary forgetfulness. In this way, wine functioned like empire itself. It promised comfort while hiding danger. It unified while dividing. It pleased while killing. As the night deepened, wine rituals grew more theatrical. Drinking games emerged. Toasts were made. Rhythms imposed. Cups drained in unison. Laughter rose. So did risk. The later the hour, the thinner the veil. Guests swayed. Words sharpened. A wrong comment could echo long after the hangover faded. Some emperors enjoyed this vulnerability. Others feared it. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and ruler, famously distrusted excess. He drank sparingly, ate simply, believing indulgence clouded judgment. His restraint stood in quiet contrast to rulers like Nero, whose banquets blurred into days-long intoxication. But even restraint was performance. Everything at the Roman table was. Wine revealed what food concealed. Where food displayed wealth, wine exposed nerves. Where dishes impressed, cups tested loyalty, and beneath it all remained the unspoken truth. The banquet table was never safe. Not because of gluttony, but because power was always watching. And power, like wine, entered slowly, spread warmly, and could kill without warning. Apicius, obsession, and the price of excess. There are names in history that stop meaning one person and start meaning an idea. Apicius is one of them. When Romans spoke of Apicius, they were not always referring to a man standing in a kitchen or reclining at a table. They were invoking a symbol, the embodiment of culinary obsession, luxury without limit, desire that had forgotten how to end. Apicius lived in the early days of the empire, when Rome had reached a point few societies ever do. It had conquered widely. Its coffers overflowed. Its elites were no longer fighting to survive, but struggling to feel something new. In such moments, appetite changes. Hunger disappears. Curiosity remains. And curiosity, when unchecked, becomes excess. Apicius was said to have spent 100 million sestertii on food alone, a sum so vast it could have funded armies, fed cities, reshaped provinces. Instead, it funded meals, not nourishment, experiences. He pursued flavor the way generals pursued territory, relentlessly, impatiently, without compromise. If a dish could be improved by distance, he demanded distance. If rarity enhanced pleasure, he chased rarity. If novelty could shock, he insisted upon it. Stories followed him like shadows. He sailed to Libya solely to sample shrimp, only to turn his ship around without disembarking when he learned the catch was inferior. He ordered animals transported alive across seas, refusing substitutes. He demanded ingredients out of season, out of reason, out of reach. Nothing was ever enough. But Apicius was not merely indulgent. He was meticulous. The cookbook associated with his name reveals a mind obsessed with precision. Measurements mattered, timing mattered, balance mattered. He recorded techniques that transformed Roman cooking, fermentations refined, sauces stabilized, textures manipulated. Dormice fattened on walnuts and honey. Flamingos stewed with dates and spice. Jellyfish rendered palatable through careful preparation. These recipes were not accidents. They were experiments. In many ways, Apicius was a scientist before science had language. He tested boundaries, he observed results, he refined relentlessly. But obsession narrows perspective. The more Apicius pursued perfection, the more perfection receded. Satisfaction shortened. Each success only raised expectation. This is the quiet tragedy of abundance. When everything is possible, nothing is fulfilling for long. Roman writers watched Apicius with fascination and disdain. Seneca mocked him openly, calling him a man who bankrupted himself with his own teeth. Others whispered admiration, awe, envy. But admiration was cautious, because Apicius represented something frightening. He showed what happened when appetite replaced purpose. Eventually, the story turns dark. When Apicius reviewed his accounts and discovered that only 10 million sestertii remained, still an unimaginable fortune, he reportedly panicked. 10 million was not poverty. It was still power. But to Apicius, it meant limitation. It meant compromise. And compromise, after a lifetime of excess, felt like death. So he chose death. According to legend, Apicius hosted one final extravagant feast, then drank poison rather than live in a world where his appetite could no longer roam freely. Historians debate the truth of this ending. Like many Roman stories, it may have been shaped to teach a lesson, but the lesson itself mattered more than accuracy. Rome needed Apicius to end this way, because his story was a warning. A civilization drowning in abundance requires examples of consequence. Someone must embody the danger of excess so others can pretend to remain balanced. Apicius became that figure. And yet, Rome continued. His techniques survived, his recipes circulated. His name lived on not as a caution alone, but as aspiration. Even as Romans criticized excess, they copied it. Even as philosophers preached restraint, diners chased novelty. The contradiction was never resolved. That is why Apicius lingers in memory. He was not an aberration. He was inevitable. Every empire reaches a point where hunger is no longer about survival, where desire outpaces necessity, where taste becomes identity. Apicius simply followed that logic to its end. But perhaps the most unsettling part of his story is not his death. It is what his story leaves out. The cooks who prepared his meals are unnamed. The slaves who sourced his ingredients are forgotten. The labor that sustained his obsession remains invisible. Apicius is remembered. They are not. And this, too, is Roman. The empire preserved symbols, not systems. Legends, not labor. Names, not hands. As the lamps dimmed after Apicius's final feast, Rome did not pause to reflect deeply. Another banquet followed. Another emperor rose. Another obsession took shape. Excess did not end. It merely changed hosts. And that is why Apicius matters. Not because he ate extravagantly, but because he showed how easily desire becomes identity, how quickly abundance erases limits, and how quietly obsession convinces us that moderation is worse than death. In Rome, the table did not just feed the body, it revealed the soul. Omens, rituals, and the gods at the table. In ancient Rome, a meal was never only a human affair. Even at the most lavish banquet, even amid laughter and wine, the gods were believed to be present, watching, listening, interpreting. A Roman table was not just a place of consumption, it was a threshold between fortune and disaster, between favor and punishment, between what was intended and what was revealed. Romans lived in a world saturated with signs. Every action, every accident, every interruption carried meaning. And nowhere were these signs watched more closely than at the table, where abundance met vulnerability. Food was intimate, and intimacy invited the divine. If a platter cracked as it was set down, conversation might stop. A dish slipping from a slave's hands was not clumsiness, it was warning. Wine spilled on the floor could signal unrest. A sudden draft extinguishing a lamp might hint at displeasure from beyond. Nothing was random, or so they believed. This belief shaped Roman dining in quiet but powerful ways. Meals were planned not only around taste, but around auspices. Certain foods were favored on particular days. Certain combinations avoided. Certain gestures repeated carefully, exactly, lest deviation invite misfortune. Before great political decisions, banquets were often held deliberately to read the signs. A successful meal, uninterrupted and smooth, suggested approval. A troubled one could delay campaigns, cancel announcements, even postpone war. History records generals who halted marches because a sacrifice failed, or because a banquet omen unsettled them. Food spoke for the gods. Eggs, for example, carried symbolic weight. They represented beginnings, cycles, rebirth. They were eaten at funerals to promise renewal, served at the start of meals to invite continuity. A cracked egg yolk could be read like a prophecy. Garlic was believed to ward off evil. It was eaten before dangerous journeys, smeared on bodies, hung in kitchens. Honey, sacred and pure, symbolized divine sweetness. It was offered to gods, fed to infants, placed on altars. Even animals carried layered meaning. Peacocks symbolized immortality, their flesh believed never to decay. Fish represented abundance and naval strength. Pomegranates signified fertility and death, their seeds echoing the underworld myths Romans inherited from Greece. Every ingredient whispered something, and the kitchen itself became a place of ritual. In temples, sacred kitchens prepared meals for gods with meticulous care. Priests oversaw every step. A mistake could invalidate an offering. A cracked plate might delay a festival. A poorly cooked dish could be interpreted as rejection. The gods were particular, and the Romans were anxious. To guard against danger, elites employed omen tasters, individuals whose job was to sample food first, not merely to detect poison, but to sense divine displeasure. A sudden nausea, an unexpected reaction, a strange taste could halt a feast entirely. These tasters bore enormous responsibility and enormous risk. They consumed uncertainty so others could relax, but even relaxation was measured. At banquets, hosts often orchestrated small, deliberate disruptions, a sudden change in course order, an unusual presentation, a dramatic pause, to see how guests reacted. Calm acceptance suggested composure. Anxiety revealed weakness. The gods were watching, but so was power. Some emperors blurred the line intentionally. Elagabalus turned meals into religious theater, serving foods dyed with sacred colors, presenting dishes as offerings to himself as divine incarnation. Guests were forced to participate, unsure whether refusal insulted emperor or god. Or both. This uncertainty was the point. Faith, when entangled with power, becomes obedience. Even philosophers who mocked superstition took part in ritual. Seneca criticized excess, but still observed signs. Marcus Aurelius wrote skeptically about fate, yet followed tradition carefully. In Rome, disbelief did not protect you. Participation did. As meals progressed, rituals deepened. Wine was poured in patterns. Toasts followed rhythm. Certain words were avoided. Certain gestures repeated. At the end of banquets, offerings were made. A splash of wine to the floor. A morsel set aside. Nothing belonged entirely to the diners. Something was always reserved for elsewhere. This belief softened the fear of mortality. If gods governed signs, then chaos had meaning. Even misfortune fit into pattern. Even death could be interpreted, contextualized, endured. The table became a place where humans negotiated with the unseen. Yet this comfort came at a cost. Superstition reinforced hierarchy. Those who understood signs wielded influence. Those who misread them suffered consequences. Priests, augurs, and interpreters gained authority simply by explaining uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. A feast gone wrong might not be blamed on a cook, but on fate. A political setback might be justified as divine warning rather than poor planning. Responsibility dissolved into ritual. In this way, belief became insulation. For emperors especially, omens were useful. They explained failures, justified delays, silenced dissent. If the gods disapproved, who could argue? But beneath all this symbolism lay something deeply human. Fear. Fear of the future. Fear of sudden reversal. Fear that abundance was temporary. Rome knew instinctively that no empire lasts forever. Its rituals were not merely religious, they were coping mechanisms. They gave structure to uncertainty, order to chaos. And the banquet table was the perfect stage. It gathered people together. It exposed vulnerability. It slowed time. It invited reflection and interpretation. As lamps dimmed and guests reclined more deeply into cushions, signs were watched more closely. A laugh too loud, a silence too long, a dish arriving late. Everything meant something. And in that belief, Rome found both comfort and control. The gods dined with them, and no one ever forgot it. The last course, what Roman feasts left behind. Every Roman banquet ended the same way, not with silence, but with absence. The final dish was cleared. The wine thinned. Lamps burned lower. Guests rose slowly from their couches, limbs heavy, minds dulled by food and ritual. Slaves collected napkins stuffed discreetly with leftovers. Cushions were shaken, doors opened, and the room emptied. What remained was not abundance, but echo. Roman feasts were designed to feel eternal while they lasted. Endless courses, endless wine, endless spectacle. But they always ended abruptly. One moment the table was full, the next it was bare. This contrast was not accidental. Romans understood impermanence deeply. That is why so many banquets ended with reminders of death. Wax skeletons, tombstone-shaped gifts, mock funerals staged between courses. These gestures were not morbid curiosities. They were philosophical punctuation. You have eaten well. You have lived fully. Now remember what waits. Even the most decadent hosts could not escape this truth. Petronius's Satyricon captures it perfectly. Drunken excess dissolving into chaos, laughter curdling into unease, the host staging his own death only to rise again demanding applause. It was comedy, yes, but it was also confession. Rome knew it was consuming itself. And yet, the feasts continued. What Roman dining left behind was not a cuisine in the modern sense. Most of its dishes vanished, ingredients changed, techniques faded, but the idea of dining, as performance, as identity, as power, endured. We still recognize it. When rare ingredients become status symbols. When meals are photographed more than tasted. When presentation matters more than nourishment. When luxury is designed to shock rather than satisfy. The Romans would understand us immediately. They would recognize the restaurant with a waiting list months long, the dish dusted with gold, the influencer documenting each bite, the belief that what we eat defines who we are. Because Rome taught the world that food is never neutral. It signals belonging. It marks hierarchy. It communicates wealth without words. Even Roman health fads echo today. Powdered gemstones for vitality, animal byproducts as tonics, fermented concoctions promising longevity. We smile at their excess, yet we chase our own versions with equal faith. Snail slime returned, rebranded. Garlic regained respect. Honey never lost its aura. Rome did not invent these obsessions. It perfected them. But Rome also left behind warnings. Its elites spent fortunes on novelty while fortifications weakened. They competed over spectacle while governance eroded. They chased sensation while stability thinned. When emperors dined on flamingo tongues and pearl-infused wine, legions were stretched thin. When power focused inward toward pleasure, the edges frayed. History rarely collapses loudly. It dissolves quietly, like a feast that goes on too long. The Roman banquet shows us something uncomfortable, that excess does not feel dangerous from the inside. It feels deserved, normal, even necessary. Rome did not fall because it ate extravagantly, but its feasts reveal a civilization that mistook indulgence for permanence. And still, there is beauty in what remains. The Roman table was also a place of connection, conversation, shared experience, stories told by lamplight, poetry recited between courses, music drifting through open courtyards. For all its cruelty and inequality, the banquet was a human space, one where people gathered, lingered, and felt momentarily held by ritual. That impulse remains. We still gather around food to slow time, to mark milestones, to feel grounded in something shared. The difference is awareness. We now know the cost of invisibility. We know who labors behind the spectacle. We know that abundance is fragile. Rome teaches us not to reject pleasure, but to understand it, to ask what it rests upon, to notice what is hidden, to remember when the room empties. As the last guest departed a Roman banquet, slaves extinguished lamps one by one. The room returned to shadow, silver dulled, cushions flattened. Morning would come. Another feast would follow, but this one was over. And so is our journey tonight. The lamps are dim now. The dishes are cleared. The echoes have softened. Ancient Rome no longer reclines beside us, but its whispers linger in how we eat, how we celebrate, how we turn meals into meaning. If sleep has found you, let it come gently. If thoughts still wander, let them drift through candlelit halls and fade. This has been Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Rest well.